Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So we've talked before about the cost of living in Israel, and we've pointed out that one of the culprits that people often point to regarding the inefficiencies and the chronically high cost of living here is this question of standardization or lack thereof. We talked about the recent pushes to do away with these Israel-specific certifications, which often seem just totally absurd. That, you know, if something is approved in Europe, that's the push, good enough for Europe, that it will automatically be certified here. And a huge amount of red tape gets put up by the Israeli Standards Organization. That makes the process of doing so much in Israel a nightmare in bureaucracy. My wife's an architect, and I've heard so much about the red tape in building permits is sometimes a beggar's belief. It's like the government is doing everything in its power to make building and developing almost impossible in this country. So I'd like to chat today, Herman and Corn, about another important aspect, I think, of regulation, and that is drug approvals, because we've talked in recent episodes about different medications. We're talking about ADHD, stimulants versus non-stimulants, and sometimes you'll read something encouraging in the news about a drug that's being tried out overseas or being approved, and you say, great, oh, that means I can get it here. And you look up the Israeli drug registry and you see that the drug has not yet been approved. These approvals are very important because in Israel we have a national basket of subsidized medications called the Sal Briut, and the difference between something being approved, it doesn't mean always that you can't get it, but it might be prohibitively expensive. So my question, Herman and Corn, is the following. We have the FDA as, you know, a giant regulator. We have the European Medical Authority. We have other regulatory bodies around the world. The big question is, why does every country feel the need to put up its own regulator in front of drugs? And in the case of small countries, we can look at Israel, but also look at other comparable small countries that aren't parts of blocs. I think that's a big advantage of the EU structure, is you might have a country like Denmark that you might say it doesn't really make sense for Denmark to redo the whole evaluation process that the Americans are already doing or that some other ministry is doing. So I think there's a huge logic for small countries in saying we trust the work of other countries. And again, maybe it's that lack of international trust that frequently stymies these efforts to make very logical steps that you think would benefit a lot of patients by avoiding the stalling up of medications by often these lengthy approval processes. So Herman and Corn, I'd love to know how this works in Israel in practice. I've heard that we take the lead from the FDA, but we have our own still rubber stamp. How does that compare to how other countries do it? And can you point to any other small countries that have instituted regulatory mechanisms for medications that are a bit more trusting and take their cues from what other larger regulators have already green-lighted? And what are the reasons, beyond a fundamental lack of trust, that some countries refuse to do that?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in a very sunny Jerusalem living room with my brother. It is February 5th, 2026, and honestly, after that cold snap we had last week, this sun feels like a gift from the heavens.
Herman Poppleberry, present and accounted for. And yeah, it is a beautiful day, though I have been cooped up inside all morning reading through some pretty dense regulatory filings from the Ministry of Health. I know, I am a barrel of laughs, but someone has to keep track of the fine print.
Well, that is actually perfect timing, because our housemate Daniel sent us a voice note this morning that is right up your alley. He was asking about something that has been a recurring theme in our house lately, especially with all the talk about the cost of living in Israel and the big reforms we saw go into effect last year.
You mean the what is good for Europe is good for Israel reform? The one that finally let us import refrigerators and cosmetics without a separate Israeli standard?
Exactly. Daniel was specifically looking at drug approvals. He was wondering why that same logic does not seem to apply to medicine. If the Food and Drug Administration in the United States or the European Medicines Agency says a drug is safe and effective, why does a small country like Israel need its own group of people to look at it all over again? Is it just a lack of trust, or is there something more structural going on? And how do other small countries handle this? Do they all have their own version of the FDA, or are some of them more, let us say, trusting of international bodies?
This is a huge topic because it sits right at the intersection of national sovereignty, public health, and economics. And you are right, we have touched on this in different ways before. I remember back in episode 1-2, we talked about the ADHD medication maze and how bureaucracy can really mess with brain health. This is like the macro version of that. It is the question of why we insist on being an economic island when it comes to the things that literally keep us alive.
So let us start with the basics. When a pharmaceutical company develops a new drug, they usually go to the big players first, right? The FDA in the States or the EMA in Europe.
Exactly. Those are the gold standards. If you get through them, you have access to the biggest markets in the world. Now, most people assume that once the FDA says yes, it is just a matter of translating the label and putting it on the shelf in Israel. But in reality, there is a two-step process here that people often conflate. There is registration, which is the legal permission to sell the drug, and then there is reimbursement, which in Israel is the Sal Briut, or the National Health Basket.
And that is a crucial distinction. Daniel mentioned the Sal Briut specifically. Just because a doctor can technically prescribe something does not mean the average person can afford it if the government is not subsidizing it.
Exactly. But even before you get to the money, you have the registration. And to Daniel's point, why does Israel have its own registration process at all? Well, the first reason is actually legal and jurisdictional. A country is responsible for the health of its own citizens. If a drug causes a massive, unforeseen side effect in Israel, the Israeli Ministry of Health cannot just point at the FDA and say, well, they said it was fine. They have a legal and ethical duty to perform their own due diligence. In legal terms, it is about the tort of negligence. If the state does not do its own check, it could be held liable.
But is that due diligence actually a new study? Are they running new clinical trials in Israel?
Almost never. For a country our size, that would be impossible. What they are doing is a regulatory review of the data that has already been submitted elsewhere, but here is where it gets interesting. They are looking at that data through a local lens. For example, does this drug interact with other medications that are common in the Israeli population? Or, and this is a big one, does the local population have genetic variations that might change how the drug is metabolized?
That is a good point. We are a very diverse population here, but we also have specific genetic markers that are more prevalent in certain communities, like Ashkenazi Jewish populations or specific Arab communities. I can see why a regulator would want to make sure the dosage recommendations from a study done in, say, Ohio, actually apply here.
Precisely. Think about things like G6PD deficiency, which is quite common in certain Jewish and Arab populations in the Middle East. If a drug has a known risk for people with that deficiency, an Israeli regulator is going to be much more sensitive to that than someone in Washington. Or take familial Mediterranean fever. We have a high prevalence of that here. A drug that might be fine for the general European population could have different implications for someone with a pre-existing inflammatory condition that is common locally.
Okay, I can buy the genetic argument. What about the environment? You mentioned environmental factors earlier.
Right. We live in a hot Mediterranean climate. In the world of pharmaceutical stability, there are different zones. Most of Europe is in Zone 1 or 2. Israel is in Zone 4B, which is hot and humid. The stability data for a drug stored in a warehouse in Sweden might look very different from a drug sitting in a pharmacy in Eilat in August. The Israeli regulator needs to ensure that the packaging and storage requirements are appropriate for our specific environment. If a pill degrades faster in 35-degree heat, that is a safety issue.
Okay, I can buy the environmental and genetic arguments to a point, but surely there is a way to streamline this. If we are talking about a standard blood pressure medication that has been used by millions of people in Europe for 5 years, does the Ministry of Health really need to sit on it for another 18 months?
That is where the friction is. And you hit on a word there, streamline. There is actually a lot of movement in this space globally. Many small countries are moving toward what we call reliance pathways. And actually, Israel just launched a major reform on this in March of 2025. They created what they call the Reliance Tracks.
Wait, so we're actually doing it? Why haven't I heard more about this?
Because it is still in the pilot phase for 2025 and 2026, but the numbers are actually quite impressive. Under Reliance Track A, if a drug has been approved by at least 2 major international agencies like the FDA and the EMA within the last 3 years, the Israeli Ministry of Health commits to a 70-day registration process. 70 days. That is a massive jump from the years it used to take.
70 days sounds like a dream. What about drugs that only have one approval?
That is, Track B. If it has one major approval from a recognized authority like the FDA, the EMA, or even the MHRA in the United Kingdom, they aim for 120 days. And they have a similar track for generic medicines. So, on paper, the registration bottleneck is finally being addressed.
So if the registration is getting faster, why is Daniel still frustrated? Why does it still feel like we are waiting forever for new treatments?
Because registration is only half the battle. This brings us back to the Sal Briut, the health basket. Even if a drug is registered in 70 days, it still has to wait for the annual committee meeting to decide if the state will pay for it. And that is where the real gatekeeping happens.
Right, the money. I saw the news that the 2026 Health Basket Committee was just appointed in November. What is the budget looking like this year?
It is sitting at 650 million shekels. Now, to you and me, 650 million sounds like a fortune. But when you look at the applications, it is a drop in the bucket. For the 2025 basket, they had requests totaling over 4 billion shekels. They could only approve about 1/3 of the drugs submitted. So you have this situation where a drug is legally registered and available in Israel, but it costs $10,000 a month, so for 99% of people, it might as well not exist.
That is the heartbreaking part. You see the headline that a new cancer drug is approved, but then you find out it is not in the basket.
Exactly. And this is where Daniel's question about trust comes back in. It is not just about trusting the science of the FDA, it is about the economic reality of a small nation. If we automatically accepted every drug the FDA approved, our healthcare budget would collapse overnight. The FDA does not consider cost when they approve a drug. They only look at safety and efficacy. But a small country with universal health care has to look at the price tag.
So the independent regulator acts as a sort of speed bump for the budget.
In a way, yes. It is a cynical view, but it is a reality. If you slow down the registration, you delay the moment when the public starts screaming for the drug to be added to the basket. It is a pressure valve for the national budget.
That is heavy. But Daniel also asked about other small countries. How do they handle this? Are we the only ones with this two-step dance?
Not at all, but some are definitely more efficient. Take Singapore. Their Health Sciences Authority, or HSA, is the gold standard for this. They have a verification evaluation route. If a drug is approved by 2 of their reference agencies, they can approve it in 60 working days. They basically say, look, the heavy lifting has been done. We are going to verify the data, check the local labeling, and get it to the patients. They are very transparent about it.
60 days. And who are their reference agencies?
They look at the FDA, the EMA, Health Canada, the TGA in Australia, Swissmedic in Switzerland, and the MHRA in the United Kingdom. It is a very specific list of high-trust partners.
And what about Switzerland? They are a small country too, but they have a huge pharma industry.
Switzerland is the exception that proves the rule. They have Swissmedic, which is considered a peer to the FDA. Because they have giants like Roche and Novartis based there, they have the expertise to do full, independent reviews. They do not rely on others. Others often look to them. But for a country like Israel, which has a great medical community but not that level of regulatory scale, trying to act like Swissmedic is where we get into trouble.
So why don't we just join a club? Is there a club for small but smart regulators?
There actually is. It is called the Access Consortium. It is a group of medium-sized, like-minded regulators. It includes Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. In fact, the UK's MHRA is actually chairing the consortium for 2026. They work together to share the workload. Instead of each country reading the same 10,000-page report, they divvy it up. One country looks at the clinical data, another looks at the manufacturing quality, and they share their findings.
That sounds incredibly logical. Is Israel part of that?
Not yet. There have been calls for Israel to join for years. It would make perfect sense. We share the same values regarding clinical evidence, and we have the scientific talent to contribute to the group. Joining would give us the best of both worlds. We keep our independent voice for those local genetic or environmental factors, but we benefit from the collective labor of other world-class regulators.
So, what is the holdup? Is it just the usual bureaucratic inertia?
Part of it is inertia. Part of it is that our Ministry of Health has its own very specific way of doing things. But the biggest hurdle is that link to the Sal Briut. If we join an international consortium and start approving drugs twice as fast, the demand for funding those drugs will double. The system as it is currently funded cannot handle that speed. It is a feature of the system, not a bug.
It is that economic island effect again. We are isolated not just by geography, but by these unique regulatory hurdles that keep the budget manageable, but also keep prices high and choices limited.
Exactly. And it is not just the drugs themselves, it is the clinical trials. If it is too hard to get a drug registered here, pharmaceutical companies might be less likely to run clinical trials in Israeli hospitals. That means Israeli patients lose out on early access to experimental treatments. It is a cascading effect that impacts the entire medical ecosystem.
You know, it is interesting you mentioned the UK being the chair of the Access Consortium this year. Since Brexit, they've had to rebuild a lot of their own regulatory capacity, but they have been very smart about using these international partnerships. They realized they could not go it alone.
That is a great point. The MHRA has been very innovative. They created something called the ILAP, the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway. It brings together the regulator, the budget people, and the National Health Service right from the start. They work with the drug company to map out the entire journey from the lab to the patient. It is a unified pathway instead of a series of hurdles.
See, that is the kind of forward thinking we need here. Instead of having these separate silos where the registration people do not talk to the budget people, you create a unified process. But that requires a level of interagency cooperation. That is, shall we say, not always the hallmark of Israeli governance.
True, we are more of a last-minute scramble at 3 a.m. kind of culture, which works great for software patches, but not so great for pharmaceutical regulation where people's lives are on the line.
So, looking ahead, do you see things changing? We have the 2025 reform pilot running right now. Does medicine ever get included in the broader standardization push?
There is a push. There was a recent amendment proposed in the Knesset that would require the Ministry of Health to justify why they are deviating from international standards for certain medical devices. It is a small step, but it is the first time we have seen that burden of proof shift from the company to the regulator. If that succeeds, I could see it eventually moving toward pharmaceuticals.
That would be a huge shift. Making the regulator explain why they are saying no, rather than making the company beg for a yes.
It would change the entire dynamic. But there will be massive pushback. The bureaucracy sees itself as the thin white line protecting the public from unsafe foreign influence. It is a deeply ingrained culture of self-reliance. And look, sometimes we are unique. Our experience with trauma care and emergency response is world-leading, but we have to be humble enough to know when we are not the experts. When it comes to the molecular stability of a new monoclonal antibody, we should probably trust the collective wisdom of the global scientific community.
I think that is a perfect place to start wrapping this up. It is about that balance of humility and sovereignty. Daniel, I hope that answers the question. It is not just about trust. It is about a complex web of legal duties, genetic nuances, environmental factors, and, perhaps most importantly, the invisible hand of the national budget.
And if you want to see how this same kind of bureaucracy plays out in other areas, definitely check out episode 301 where we talked about how AI is being used at the borders to scan parcels. It is the same tension. How do you move things fast without compromising on safety?
Or episode 102 for more on the ADHD med maze. It is a recurring theme for us because it affects so many people's daily lives. We have over 480 episodes in the archive now, and you can search them all at myweirdprompts.com.
Truly. And hey, if you are listening to this and you have your own thoughts on the Sal Briut or the Ministry of Health, or maybe you have worked in one of these agencies and want to tell us why we are wrong, get in touch. We love hearing from experts who can pull back the curtain even further.
You can find the contact form on our website. And while you are there, if you are enjoying the show, could you do us a huge favor? Leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It sounds like a small thing, but it really helps the algorithm show our weird prompts to more people.
Yeah, it genuinely makes a difference. We are a small, independent operation, and your support is what keeps us going. Well, and the coffee. Lots of coffee.
Mostly the coffee. Alright, I think that is it for today. Thanks for joining us on My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.
Shalom.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.